Okay, for people joining this live stream, this is part of a long series of meetings designing database integration functionality for Wolfram Language. And I believe we're starting today with a kind of a knotty problem about entities. So can somebody remind me what the problem is?
Okay, so where we left off last time, we're discussing whether when you ask for the entity list of an entity class, for example, whether the single entities should remember that they were coming from a specific entity class. And the problem is that it is obvious to everybody that there are some things you can't just remove from the entity first argument, such as entity extend, because otherwise you cannot perform the extension anymore. But some others can peel away. And
okay, so let's take an example here. Okay, so you're saying if we make an entity class here, which is, I have to say, I'm not wild about the way that this is displayed, because when it says countries here, you know, maybe what this should say is, Michael here, by the way?
Yep.
Maybe what this should say is gray words, class of countries. Because that way it's not saying, you know, it might suggest here that this is kind of all countries, which it's obviously not.
Well, I mean, if you press the little plus thing, I'm pretty sure it shows you the like what it's selecting for, right? So
yes,
you just have to be careful that, I mean, I guess it already has this problem that class of countries doesn't sound like all the countries, right? The class of all countries. But I guess if it just says countries, that also kind of suggests that it's all countries.
Yeah, right. But I mean, so class.
Also, entity food, like implicit entities, get a very similar formatting. That might be confusing, I think.
Well, okay, but so we should unravel that issue. So what's an example of a food case here, Michael?
Chocolate chip cookies, control equal. But Jeremy explicitly thought kind of the distinction in the dots versus the one thing is big is good enough.
I don't think it is. Okay. I mean, I find it confusing every time. We can quiz people on who is dot, you know, who is really noticing the dots. So explain to me. Okay, let's look at the different cases here. So in this case, this is recording the fact that you asked, this is a foods thing, but it's about chocolate chip cookies, right? But in this case, it's a countries thing. I mean, if I'd said here.
Yeah, but they are two very different things, because that country is basically a list of country, and food is an implicit entity with it somehow union or an aggregate of those, whatever you want to.
Well, so let's try it. Sorry, here, let's say G8 countries. Oops. What does that do? Oh, so that's an entity class, a named entity class.
Correct.
But then there are these generated entity classes, which are being represented like this, right?
Yeah.
And what is this? How can you compare this to those other things? What is that?
It's like a mixture between coarse graining and projection, in the sense of with the countries you can enumerate and explicitly on a tablet give every single one. But the chocolate chip cookies, we have 620 of them. This would be pointless, because if you have one, you only know you have a chocolate chip cookie. This is all your information available.
As opposed to subsetting, which is the country's case. Is that right?
Yeah.
Actually, the technical difference is that in the entity case, you apply an additional step. First, you select the bare entities and then you aggregate. While in the entity class case, you have no aggregation.
Sorry, I didn't understand that. You're saying this case here.
If you ask for a property of this one, you get a list of values.
Whereas in this one,
you get, like, you don't get 620.
What is it called? Calorie?
No, what is it called? Getting mixed up myself. No, it's not. Total calorie content, I think. Also not.
Oh, come on. What is the, okay, so if I say sodium in chocolate chip cookies, that should show me what it is. I hope. Why is it spinning? Why did that not work?
This I don't know right now. We will look into it.
Well, let's say calories. This is, I don't know what version I'm running here. Let's take a look. I don't even know. What version should I be running to see this?
Oh, you need owl mode in front.
Oh, okay. All right, fine. Fine. But what this will do is it will give a number.
It will give a number, exactly.
Okay, whereas you're saying if I say %1 subpopulation, it will give a list.
It is, I feel like there's no intrinsic thing. It's a human thing. Like, typically, you never refer abstractly to one of the 3 possible countries, to one of the G8s. You refer to all of them, or you know which one. Where with respect to food and materials, you know it's a piece of steel. Of the 5,400 standardized types of steel, you don't know which one it is. So it would be not useful to return this long list of values.
Right, but so there is, in a sense, an aggregator function which is being applied, which in this case is just the function list. But it could also be the function total, or it might be the identity. I don't know exactly what. It could be identity there, right? That's giving you that list. Whereas here, the result is some kind of mean, isn't it?
Yes.
It depends on the property.
Yeah.
Okay. Okay. But okay, so what?
That's not the only difference. The other difference is that if you take the entity class and apply entity list to it, there is an entity list. On the other hand, on an entity list doesn't work because you're not thinking about the constituents anymore.
Okay, so if I say entity list of %2,
I think it does work for niceness because people wanted it. But in some sense, it doesn't make sense. But it doesn't make. But it's better
actually
than
wrong.
failing. But it's better than failing. I feel like. I mean, that's a natural extension.
Yes. So it resolves to disgorge whatever we think we know about this.
Yeah, but shouldn't this be just a property of the food? Like, give me all the constituent instead of exploring an entity list?
These are not constituents. These are alternatives that count as chocolate chip cookies.
It still can be a properties of that, whatever it is.
Yeah, but look.
It's
okay.
property.
I mean, this operation
is,
suggests the fact that you can expand this thing, but actually...
Okay, ontologically, the issue is this. These are alternatives. That is, when you say chocolate chip cookies, you're typically thinking of a particular chocolate chip cookie, and these are some of the alternatives. When you say G8, you're thinking of the aggregate of a bunch of countries. You're not thinking of it's a country from, from the G8, one of them, but I'm just not telling you which.
Actually, you said the word aggregate, and in the context of aggregate, it's probably the other way around. In that the cookies are a list of cookies that get aggregated into a particular median or average cookie, and the countries don't get aggregated. You could also construct a cookie which is like the sum of all possible cookies.
Well, okay, let's talk about GDP per capita for the G8. In that case, you probably would want to aggregate the countries.
Not if you're writing entity class of the G8. That's not an aggregate. And also, the aggregate of the GDP per capita of the G8 is not trivial. You can't just do the mean of what.
No, I understand. However, snackimals does sound like the kind of thing one wants. Never mind.
I mean, the G8 is just a filter of the countries. It's a subset of them.
Yes,
it's
I
still
understand.
an entity class.
Okay, listen, there's a couple of issues here. So one thing is we are representing an implicit, a pop-up entity class. I mean, this is effectively a pop-up entity class. Is that a fair statement?
I don't think we have used this phrase pop-up, but yes.
Okay, but the thing that you guys are talking about with entity extend and so on is another form of pop-up entity class. Is that a true statement?
Yes.
Okay, and what we are discussing here is in part, let's see, is what? Is how to represent, okay, so this is a pop-up property. Okay, so this is an entity value. By the way, is the alternative form here to say countries in North America brackets entity function?
Yes.
Okay. Does that work in a prototype build?
Yes.
Let's try it. So what you're saying is, so that, and it's kind of nice actually. I mean, so what you say, let me just try this. So you're saying, okay, so let's take this thing here. Why is that blue? Do I need to load something?
I think needs entity framework.
Let's see, this is under databases. Sorry, SW notes 14. Okay, so you say that's going to work. It's very slow, whatever it's doing.
Yes, it's not so optimized yet.
Well, this is really slow. But you're saying, okay, what was it doing? I mean,
it is retrieving one value at a time.
Okay. All right, so then this case, this will do the same thing. Nope, didn't, but it's supposed to.
Because the list has no subvalues.
So that evaluates to a list, is that right? So
yeah.
In fact, you were wrong when you said that. So this thing here, you're saying explicitly evaluates to that list. So it's in fact not an entity class anymore.
Yeah.
So what's the way? Okay, so that was a little bit of a confusion there. Okay,
because we don't have quite technology yet to build dynamic entity classes based on geo properties.
Okay, but in this case here, we did build a dynamic entity class. So if I were to do this, then I can do of entity function, whatever, right?
Yes.
Oops. Okay. Now, let's say I wanted to take the average of those. How would I do that? Would I just do mean outside the whole thing?
I guess it now depends on the meaning of the word mean.
I understand. I mean, the other case, I would want to get separate lists and then mess around with it. Okay, fine. So let's come back to what your question was. So my first point is, I think this is very unclear what this is. I think we should improve that. I mean, we could maybe have a term like computed class. For example, let's imagine that this thing here said something like that this visually said a little bit like it says geographic region. We could say something like computed class.
But what will you do when you have like a bunch of nested, joined, aggregated things? Like at some point, there comes a point where you don't even know what to call it anymore. Like you don't know what
its type is.
Yeah. Like for example, in the entity aggregate by example, if you take countries aggregated by continent, what are they?
Wait, where's the entity aggregated by example?
You must have it somewhere in one of the old notebooks. But just type it. Entity aggregate by country, continent.
Wait a minute. So I'm typing country here.
Country, comma, continent. And then you want a rule that goes, say, let's say you can say maximum, comma, comma. And then say something like maximum population, max population, and then you write entity function. That's a string. That's a string. No, string. Max population.
Well, I mean, it's
call it something.
Okay, max p, whatever it is, yeah.
Arrow, entity function. X, comma, X, max. No, what? Max, X, population.
What the heck does the max p thing do? Why do I need that?
You need it because otherwise you have no properties.
But so what do I do with this now? What do I do with this thing now?
Well, you can do entity value on it and get out either continent or max p, or both.
Or using subvalues.
Yeah.
Okay, so entity aggregate by, which is displaying as a nothing here, but it could display as something. Or maybe not, as the case may be.
Right. What is this anyway? So if you ask for max p, you're going to get the population of, I don't know, China.
One question here is this yellow box useful? I mean, it's useful to see that the thing didn't just sit there, dumb. But this yellow box, it might actually be that form is as useful as is more useful than the yellow box.
I think that we're going to hit the brick wall as soon as we have a bunch of nested things like that.
So question for Michael and Tony. Do you think that, why did we choose to make that thing into a yellow box like this?
Because it is, there's no real difference for most purposes between an entity class that we have defined and one that you define.
But one that we've defined, that is G8.
Yeah.
Okay, so then we say, let's say G8 there. Okay. Well, maybe we need some compromise way to present this where you actually can see all of that text. Because I think it's not particularly useful. This form is as confusing as it is useful. Now, this thing here arguably is useful, but that's a different thing because you've given...
That's literally what you had in your natural language query.
Yeah, I know. So let's imagine that I said 3 largest countries. Okay. Is that really the right interpretation? Well, anyway, who knows whether that's the right interpretation? But that, oh boy. So wait a minute. In the foods case here, oh, I see. That's kind of weird that it loses the chocolate chip cookie information there.
No, I disagree. We discussed this. One of the main reasons is it's also a question of identity and equality. Like if you have a misspelling in chocolate chip cookies, it's still the same chocolate chip cookies. This means at least after evaluation, they must be in some kind of canonical form.
Yeah. Okay. So this thing here, well, there is in fact code for this. And if I said input form of %11, right, I will see that. Okay.
I think that one of the questions is like, so far entities were a thing that was pretty much always accessed through control equals. And as we move more towards a situation where you can program with entities, I think that obfuscating the input form might not be the best.
Well, I kind of agree with you. But in the case of this one here, the input form is quite impenetrable. Right?
Well, it could be made better now that we have entity aggregate by, because if you think about it, this one is just saying, take the entities aggregated by food type and added food type, and then the entity ID could specify which one of the aggregates you're taking.
Well, okay, listen. If we look at this form here, right, this local area take largest 3, right, that's clearly a formatted thing, and we could certainly, that entity property of food type could be formatted that way. Making sense?
Yes.
And similarly, this entity here. So, I mean, there is a form of this. So just to be clear.
Yeah, but the most important piece of information here, which is that one of them...
Hold on. If I take this here and I do Command-Shift-N, is that going to work? Oh, my God. No, it doesn't. What did that do? How do I do what I want to do here? Well, let's see. I could take that inner part there and that inner part. Yeah, I mean, so that's a perfectly civilized display for this. And arguably, I mean, this stack display that we worked very hard on, I guess that's a reasonable display too. I mean, that's just a display of that list.
Yeah.
But when it gets more complicated, using that list would probably be a better idea because it can have all kinds of other functions in it.
I was going to say the opposite. If it gets more complicated, like for the economic stuff, you really don't want to see all of them.
I really think
what's a good example of that? Seasonally adjusted.
Yeah, this guy, exactly this stuff.
Seasonally adjusted unemployment rate.
And you need the countries.
Wow. Those are attributes, right?
Yeah.
Okay. So what's your point over here? So the issue is, as we generate a more complicated computed class, how do we display it? Because what we're doing here, right, and right now, this is just acting dumb and just displaying as its input, right?
Yeah.
Did this actually work? Sorry, did that work?
I wanted to
wait. If I did this work? If I say that max P, does it work?
I hope so.
No, it doesn't work. Is it supposed to work?
I don't know. It works with databases. I don't know if it works with
well, I just fixed some issues with using just a string.
Try typing entity property in full instead of max P, or where is
in the type argument. So
I'm sorry? What?
So
to be fixed.
What should I type now? Tony, what should I type now?
I think you could try wrapping the first argument of entity aggregate by into an entity class. But yeah, this will be fixed in later builds.
So here,
you mean like country around country type?
Yes.
Yeah, entity class. And then empty list as a second argument.
Empty list?
Yeah.
Oh boy.
Yeah, now try applying maxp to it. Now it's thinking.
What the heck is that? Well, that's probably Antarctica. What is that?
Yeah, oh, well, just do, instead of just maxp, do open list maxp, continent. Yeah.
What's that?
What's that? Is there a country that is not in any continent?
Okay, how do I ask that question?
Okay, you can do entity class country. Comma, continent goes to missing, not available.
And now I have to rather annoyingly do entity list there. That's pretty wild. Is that right? Hey, does Christopher know if that's right? Do you happen to know?
I mean, I think I'm not sure it's well defined. I mean, there are even different countries have different definitions of different continents. So I mean, I think it probably could be thought of as right, but I'm not sure.
Okay.
Well, there was another thing that I wanted to point out, which is if you look at the
what is GeoList plot? Oh, I see. It's actually outlining those countries. Never mind. Yeah, go ahead.
So if you look at the way that that implicit entity class is displaying, and the way that G8 was displaying, and the way that food was displaying, I think that we're aligning a lot of information. Like the implicit entity class of countries and the G8 are kind of the same object. The food is a much different object.
All right, so what are you proposing? So, I mean, the main issue is for something like entity aggregate by, the question is, how do we display this? Is this the question? And okay, what was the original question?
What is an entity?
Yeah, okay, so the original
predicative or impredicative?
We've designed entities so far for an unchanging or a very slow changing word. Now the question is, we left off last time saying that we should peel off all filters out of the entities, because and that's what we're doing right now. So if you ask for the entity list of entity class country G8, you forget that it was coming from G8. But as soon as you extend it, adding some property, you cannot remove that class anymore because it's inside. And so you can get in a situation where you have two pretty similar constructs, and one is remembering the filter and the other isn't. And so the moment that we Italians get kicked out of the G8 and Spain takes our place, then what happens to the entity list that you have left over in your notebook? Should Italy still be considered existing or not? Right now, this depends on the context.
Okay. Let me try to understand this. What is this? What on earth is this? What happened here?
No, that's not how things should work, Tony.
Yes.
What is this supposed to do?
No, the correct thing is on your left.
I don't understand what that thing is there. What is that?
Okay, read the first one. The first one, no, the first one in the second list. So the first one is Canada, which has an added property that is basically the name in lowercase.
Yes. Okay, so that's, I see. So that's wrapping the entity class. That's an extension to the entity class that is being made visible there.
Exactly.
For every one of those countries, it's an extended entity class that has that extension.
Yes. And so basically, the moment Italy stops being in G8, the fourth entity in your list will say missing unknown entity, because the filter will filter it out.
What filter? I'm sorry. What
G8
filter?
is a filter.
Oh gosh.
G8 is
the filter, which is, yeah.
Countries can get kicked in and out of G8.
No, I understand.
I mean, we really need to decide what entity list is doing, right? I mean, this is the question. I mean, what is the behavior that you want? Entity list is some kind resolving something, and it's returning a list of things. So if you're doing G8, it's returning a list of 8 countries. Now the question is, do we need to remember this information? I don't know. Probably, in my view, maybe no, because if it is an entity,
like entity value is also a resolver. Entity value gives you a result.
Yes, we need to decide what entity list is resolving and what entity list is not resolving.
In my view, you can't forget, you can forget some things about the original query, but since you can't forget all of them, then you will have inconsistencies like the one you have there on the screen.
Okay, but hold on. Look, we all agree that entity value, like 2 plus 2, gives 4, and the 4 no longer remembers that it came from 2 plus 2. Right?
Yeah, that's fine.
Okay, so entity value is doing that. It's a resolver.
Yeah, but entity list is like partial evaluation.
Okay, but so let's talk about what entity list means. What do we claim entity list is doing? First question. Okay. It's a bit vague and it's incredibly short documentation here.
I mean, the thing, Carlo, is that, if you have like a symbolic entity list, which basically is entity class, right? Then in the end, the moment, a country changes there, when you resolve properties again, you will get like, it will be remembered the original context because it will be lazy. But entity list is resolving right now to a list with the exact number of the entities that were inside at the moment you evaluated entity list.
Yeah, but it's
and so it's resolving the filter. And then I think that at least the filter should be stripped out, because basically once it's an operation that is resolving that.
No, not it resolves less than that, Ricardo. It only resolves the primary key, which is
right. But it's also resolved the count, right? And yes. So this point where basically you're saying, if you have something like, entity list and greater, and with population greater than something, right? Since he's resolving the count of this thing.
Yeah, but the thing is that you end up being like, we can peel off some things, but we can't peel off all of them. Like some of these things, I mean, if the outermost thing is an extension, is an aggregation, is a join, then you're screwed. So the filter that you had inside is still there. So I think
I understand that when you nest,
and that's something you explained to me, and I don't know why you're doing an about face about it now.
Well, because we need to understand what we're doing. And in this case, I see this inconsistency.
Yeah, there is a huge inconsistency, and that's what I pointed out on the notebook that we sent. I mean, We had half an hour to discuss the agenda. Now you're changing your mind like
okay,
that?
hold on.
No,
Okay.
Carlo, I said it before when we discussed that entity list.
Okay, okay. So the question again is, what does entity list do? Does it resolve to, the problem is that entities are no longer simple things. Entities themselves have, in the past, we thought of entities as basically static, end of the road, literals like numbers and things. But now entities can themselves be computed in various ways. Right?
Exactly. That's exactly the point.
So the question is, can entity list, so I mean, put it in a particular way, can entity list return entities that still have to compute things, i.e., are symbolic?
But in some sense they are, no?
I think that they have to, because if you say something like entity extend, like the example of entity extend, if you strip off the entity extend, then there is no way you can access that property out of the entity list anymore. Because where is it?
Yeah, it belongs to a runtime type. It doesn't belong to the original one. So the entity have to keep track of that runtime type that was creating it.
But I don't understand. I mean, Carlo, technically, when you are resolving the primary key, you do entity list of a crazy query, like aggregation and things like that. You put the filter in that basically is either the primary key or something more complex, right? And so you are basically creating a new filter out of an existing filter, right? Is that correct or no?
I don't understand what you just said.
You have an entity class with a filter,
yes,
aggregation and everything.
Yes.
And then you call entity list of that.
Yeah.
And now you take the query, the original query, and on top of that you build another filter that represents,
which is not a filter, because by the way that these operations are generated, you know that that the thing you have in the second argument of entity is indexing always a single entity, a single row in that table, basically. So a single entity in that list. So there is a very big difference between the first filter and the second filter.
I'm losing this. Okay, look. The question is, in entity list, what has always been the case in the past is that entity list returns the, explicit entities, right?
Yeah, and the thing is that the entities are no less explicit here. It's just that they come from a runtime type.
What do you mean the entities are no less explicit?
Like if you look at the entities that you have on the left selected, those are very explicit. The first one is Canada.
Yeah, but it is okay. The issue with it is that it's had this weird property added to it. So it no longer is the entity Canada. It's Canada with this extension.
Yes. And
I mean,
that's important.
Sorry to interject. Philosophically, there's a choice here. If this is predicative or impredicative, one could still say it's still Canada. It's not obvious that it must be another entity.
I agree.
Yeah, but like at least from the point of view of the syntax of the language, philosophically you can argue that it's still Canada. But if you then want to copy paste that in another notebook and ask for
no, I understand. So this entity extend thing is not going to make sense anymore.
Why?
No, it will still make sense.
No, it doesn't, because as you've said, that entity extend might conflict with, in other words, this entity here may be an entity that simply isn't in the G8 anymore.
Exactly. And that simply means that this entity as a whole stops existing, which is correct.
I I think that's somehow for me the wrong wordage. Existence is not existence is a problem outside of the language.
But Michael, there are two different types of operations. There are operations that operate on the properties, like entity extend, and all things like filters, sorting, etc., operate on the entities themselves. And so,
no disagreement.
What?
No disagreement.
Okay, so the claim is that all the operations that exclusively operate on the entities can be peeled away. Obviously, the ones that operate on the properties cannot be peeled away. Now, the question is really whether that will end up making sense to our end users. We can go both ways, but in the case we don't peel anything, there is that equality on top of the other notebook that holds. In the case that we peel some things away, we have to explain in documentation that this head, and this head can be peeled away, but only if they are at the top level. Otherwise, if they're deeply nested inside something else, then we cannot peel it away anymore. And then we get into situation of like, I was doing very similar operation. Why did this one fail and this one didn't? And it's probably not a big problem with built-in entities because they don't change very often. But when we deal with external databases, things can change every millisecond. So it is important to answer this question.
Okay, let's review again what the question is. Okay.
The question is, do you want me to formulate or do you want to?
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay, so the question is this. Given that in principle, we can say that a few operations can be removed from the definitions of the entity type, while a few others obviously cannot, should we like differentiate between the two classes, or should we always keep all operations?
Okay,
which makes
look, the main problem here is that you are trying to keep a bunch of things symbolic. You know, in the past, everything evaluated as soon as it could with respect to entities.
There is a good reason why we are trying to do this way.
I understand that, but you're getting yourself tangled up as a result of this. I mean, it's just like if you're doing math and you don't evaluate 2 + 2 to 4, and you keep it as 2 + 2, pretty soon you lose canonicalization and the whole thing falls apart, which is the same as you're seeing here. You're losing canonicalization because you've got a bunch of history dependence for things which are in fact the same.
They are not the same. That's what we are trying to show.
There is one thing that is only one thing that is really problematic, and that's entity list. Because entity value is always eagerly evaluating just values. Entity list stays half symbolic. And so that's the problem. If you have something
half symbolic.
Well, it's like when you have entity, if you ask for entity list, entity class country G8, you evaluate something. And then you can take that notebook again 5 years later. The list of countries in G8 has changed.
All right. What about the possibility that we treat entity list like entity value as an eager evaluation thing, which can leave no symbolic structures left?
And so how can you return a list of entities without having symbolic structure?
No, I'm saying that this extension, for example, this extended stuff would just say, that's nice. Well, okay.
No, the extension is trivial to leave it there. I think it will be an error to remove it.
What do you do with the aggregation of the continents, for example?
What's that?
The aggregation of the continents. What do you return there?
What do you mean, the aggregation?
Turn back to the other example there where you did entity aggregate by. If you do entity list of that, what are the single entities of that?
Well, so let's take a look. Entity, what is it right now? So let's say line 15. What the hell is that? What is that?
So
that's for every country.
For every continent. The first one is going to be, just take the first.
What the heck is this?
Yeah, what is that?
That's every country in that first continent. resolve.
That should just say Europe or whatever in the second argument.
Well, what happened here?
Yeah, this particular feature is not implemented yet. That's why we need this input to finalize what we actually want.
Okay, but so what should this do? What I mean, this is a very particular case.
In my opinion, we need to preserve a particular identity. And the identity is, if we say entity value of a class, property, then we get certain things out. If we did the same but applied entity list to this entity class, then we need to get the same result.
If you claim that, then my example on the left.
Wait a minute, what are you saying? Entity list, what?
Right, entity value, write this, entity value of query, properties is equal to entity value and list of query, properties.
Yes, and for this identity to hold, in certain cases, like in aggregates and joins, we need to have more complex type information in the first argument of entity.
Oh, in all cases, also entity class, because of the evaluation semantic of the language, entity list will evaluate separately, and if in that millisecond something changed, this doesn't hold anymore.
Yeah, but I don't think that for application kernel this behavior is natural. Like, you know, let's say that you have like an application that got people in a database, right? And you search by email. You search with my email inside this database, you get out one guy. And then if this guy changes the email, this guy stops existing. That will be confusing to people because now you got this entity with, I don't know, Ricardo or something. And just because I changed the email, I stopped being myself or something. You know, it's really something that I think it's.
If you change, yes, I mean, what determines the identity of an entity? Like, I don't think that equality between entities is well defined. Like,
no, what I'm saying is that for real data, you know. If you have a query and you do a complex query and the data changes a lot, basically this entity will become meaningless in a few seconds, you know, because the data underlying, if it's changing a lot, then basically, you know, this query is not meaningful anymore. I think like this thing it's useful if it's basically, you know, you do entity list of something and you get out an entity that is identified with a primary key. Now, that is useful because it never changed, you know.
That's not true. You can't do that. There's no way you can do that. And the example on the left shows that.
Exactly.
You can't do that.
The only way why you can do that? I mean, the moment it's a different paradigm. The moment you resolve G8, you get out 8 guys, and they always stays like that, right?
But you forget they are still symbolic. They don't stay like that. They are not resolved to their values.
Well,
they are resolved.
When do they not resolve to their values?
Because they're still entities. They're still handles to the rows. They're not actual values.
I'm sorry, but in which case, where you say entity, go ahead. What?
No, you go ahead.
Okay, I was saying that when you resolve entity list, you get the list of entities. They're still symbolic handles. They're still lazy. The only thing you resolve about them is a primary key. That's it. Everything else
right.
is...
But if you resolve the primary key, so, you know, what I don't like is that you are resolving something and you are resolving the count. You are resolving the primary keys. And now the fact that you are remembering some information about the query, it means that this can stop existing. This is not useful at all, I think.
Which only tells you that entity list is not a very well thought out abstraction.
Absolutely, but if we have that, the only thing that is meaningful to me that this thing should do is that basically you resolve like to a list of entities that get a primary key, and you just document the fact that basically, yeah, you have resolved the filter.
But this means that for this, yeah, okay, go ahead.
Ricardo, if you take something like, there is nothing special about the canonical name. Like, you can construct an entity aggregate by, as we have shown, with the continent. And so you can do it with international organizations. And then at that point, the primary key of the table becomes something that is dependent on the data not changing. So in some cases, you have things that don't change. In some cases, you have things that change. I think it just gets very confusing.
Listen, why do what is entity list useful for? Why do we want entity list?
I don't.
No, but I'm just asking.
Me neither.
I mean, what we could do is that basically you can also say that entity list of an aggregation or something, it cannot be done. You know, I mean, it only works for trivial cases, which is basically, you know, a simple filter right now. And I think this is a sensible thing to do. I mean, at least to me, it will be confusing if, you know, I get 8 entities and one of them will stop existing because there was the filter inside.
But in some cases, that will happen regardless.
Okay, but
what I'm saying is that in those cases, we just don't make possible entity lists. We just either fail or something.
Well, the other possibility is that entity list resolves and strips everything. It just is a convenience function.
How can it strip everything?
You cannot really do that, Stephen, because if it is an aggregation or a join or something, then this wouldn't work.
So
you will end up either with duplications or good.
May I summarize the 3 different cases why we might, or the 3 different reasons why we might want to preserve structure in the first argument of entity? So one reason is we are creating a completely new table in during an aggregation or during a join. There's no way these new entities are related to the original tables they came from. So there's no way around it. The second case is we're introducing some new properties. We need to keep them too, because otherwise the entities that we get don't have these properties anymore. And then the third reason is we need provenance, where the entities came from, to decide whether they still exist or not.
I don't understand that last one.
That means in the notebook on the left, you see entity list of entity class country G8.
Yeah, right.
The question is, do we preserve the entity class in the first argument of entity or not? If yes, then we would know that the entity
I think that's not a correct case. I think by the time you're doing entity list, at the moment when you do it, you decide whether the entity exists or not.
Except you cannot always do it. And the second example shows that, like, they're very, very, very similar, and yet they have completely different results. Like, actually, if you ask only for, if you don't ask for the extension, you ask for the population in both cases, they should effectively be performing the same operation, because the extension is like basically simplified out. And yet they will return different results.
Yeah. Oh boy. Okay. We are again running out of time. What are we going to do here?
I think we need a continuation.
Unfortunately, yes. But I think, you know, the first thing we're realizing here is that, you know, if we just said entity list only works in the trivial cases, would that solve our current problem?
Not sure that it would do that entirely, because the real problem is with single entities more than with entity list.
What
they also enter
entities. What?
The real problem, I think, is with single entities, because they then can appear in other places as well, such as, you know, entity property association or other forms of entity value in a way in which it returns.
Why
the
is there a
result.
problem with those?
Because even if we have things like entity property association, even in that case, we still have the same issue about single entities.
Why? What's the issue?
The issue is that we whether we want to keep the entire runtime type or not. And I think that both me and Ricardo, on Carlo, we think that yes.
Okay, so wait a minute, wait. So entity value, we all agree that that's not the case. Entity value, immediately evaluates to whatever the value is. True?
Yeah, okay, but you can still do entity value of entities, and that's equivalent to entity list. You can still do entity association.
Yes, that's what I was saying.
And that's entity list. So, I mean, we can't just sweep the thing under the rug by saying
what is entity association? What?
Entity value.
Yeah.
Then you do whatever you want, entity class G8, whatever. And then you say, comma, entity association. You need another property before you do that. Otherwise, you get huge results. Say population there. Yeah. And so if you take the keys of this, then you have single entities again.
And your point is, I see, it's passed through. Yeah, I understand. So the issue is, but we could insist somehow that when it passes through entity value, that it resolves.
Resolves what?
Well, entity association could be defined to never allow a computed entity here.
But what if it's what if the entities are the aggregates with continents? Then how do you still need that to identify them?
Yeah, I understand. And the problem is that as a runtime matter, one of those entities might decide it doesn't exist anymore.
For example.
And that can happen even with base entities. Like if you have a database with orders on, or for example, in our own bugs database, when a bug is closed, it gets moved to another table. So the bugs stop existing as it was.
Yeah.
It's not just a flag.
This is a nasty problem.
Well, right. In some sense, this problem reflects that the single entity is not the best abstraction, because we always want some properties from entities.
The concept that an entity is ultimately a literal, that it actually resolves to something. Yes, in some sense, you could say nothing ever resolves. Same thing that you could do, if you're doing math, you could say nothing ever resolves. That is, if you want to track through, oh my gosh, let's not resolve it because X might be 0 and X over X might not be equal to 1. Right?
Well, actually, you can resolve entity classes, and that's perfectly fine. They're a very well-defined concept.
Well,
entity classes, sure.
No, only these literal entity classes, not an implicit entity class. An implicit entity class might say, countries with more than 1 billion, with a population more than 1 billion.
Yeah.
But the resolution of that will change over time.
Oh yeah, that's for sure.
Well, but that's also true of the named ones.
Yeah.
Like as soon as new countries join the European Union, the name entity class.
But that's not a problem for an entity class.
That's just a shorthand for a membership.
Yeah.
Property in a sense. So.
I mean, my fear is really that you have some code that is running like over some data that really changes a lot, and if you're using entry list, it might be that after a few milliseconds, when you do the other operation, that thing stopped existing. It can be that, of course, like the entity was deleted in any case, so of course there is always the chance that it stopped existing. But if you have like a clear reference to the entity that is done with the primary key, then at least a couple of milliseconds later, you are still in good shape. Now, I understand that is not a good practice probably to use entity lists when you have this kind of data, but still people can do like this kind of mistake. Or, you know, I would like not you know, I think this design can really be problematic when you have when you're dealing with real-time data or things like that. And
all right, we have to pick this up another time. Frustrating. Let's try to pick it up within a few days so we have not forgotten the issues. Okay.
Yep.
Yep.
Okay. See you guys soon.
bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.